The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, or Jug as it was affectionately nicknamed by its pilots, was powered by the 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp turbo-supercharged engine. As it entered service, it operated as a fighter escort, protecting bombers on their missions deep into occupied Europe. Its turbo-supercharger gave it excellent performance at the high altitudes the bombers flew at. It performed this mission so well that few would have guessed it would eventually switch to a ground attack role. As the war continued, the range of escort fighters increased, and with 2 drop tanks fitted, the P-47 could now fly 1,300 miles, more than enough to escort bombers on the 1,000-mile round trip to Germany. The Thunderbolt carried a lot of ammunition, 3,400 rounds of .50 caliber. Pilots would often find themselves with lots of ammo left over on the return trip back to England. To use it up, they began attacking targets of opportunity on the ground, such as trains, trucks and armour. P-51s would also do the same, but being fitted with a liquid-cooled engine made these attacks much riskier. Whilst it was an outstanding air-to-air fighter, its belly-mounted radiator was very exposed to ground fire. Damage to the radiator and the subsequent loss of vital engine coolant would result in catastrophic engine failure within minutes. By comparison, the P-47 with its air-cooled engine proved much more rugged and able to withstand the damage that would often be sustained during these attacks. It was also big and heavy, almost 8 tons when fully loaded. This weight made it a very stable gun platform, and the size meant much more armour could be fitted around the pilot. The absence of a belly-mounted radiator also meant that in the event of a gear-up emergency landing, the Jug was less likely to dig into the ground and flip over, further increasing survivability. Finally, it was fast, 87 mph faster than an A-20 for example. It could swoop in and pull away before enemy ground units could react with effective fire. But despite these advantageous design characteristics, it was still an incredibly dangerous job. And these ground attack missions would often result in pilots returning with the tops of trees and telephone cables tangled in their propellers and air intakes. As the war continued, the P-51 took over bomber escort duties from the P-47, and it became a dedicated fighter bomber. In the build-up to D-Day, they would fly missions over France, targeting marshalling yards, bridges, and what often proved the most dangerous target, airfields. The objective was to cut off Normandy from the rest of the Reich and disrupt the logistics of the German army, blunting its ability to bring in reinforcements and supplies. During May 1944 alone, thousands of sorties were flown in this effort. But the ground attack training they had received back in the States had left a lot to be desired, and it soon became clear that they would have to develop new tactics. Lessons were harsh and often written in blood, with pilots sometimes being caught in the explosion of their own bombs or crashing straight into the ground after miscalculating a dive. Through trial and error, they pioneered and refined new techniques for dive bombing and strafing. They would be assigned a rectangular area to patrol in. Crossing the front lines at 10,000 feet, they would then descend down to 5,000 feet once arriving in their assigned area and begin hunting for targets. One of the most effective ways to spot enemy vehicles was to fly parallel alongside roads and train tracks. When a target was identified, they would arm their bombs, and once the target had disappeared underneath the leading edge of the wing, a split S manoeuvre would be performed into a near vertical dive. As the target came into their sights, they would release their bombs at 2,500 feet and recover. After the bomb release, they would continue strafing with .50 caliber until all targets were completely destroyed or they ran out of ammunition. These tactics differ slightly from modern-day close air support, or CAS, in that ground attack in World War II was much more of a hit-and-run affair. D-Day for the P-47 pilots and ground crews would begin in the very early hours of the morning. Not that many of the pilots were able to get much sleep anyway. They chose to occupy themselves with the checking and rechecking of timings, maps, equipment and anything else they could think of. Finally, at 03:36, the first P-47s took off and began to form up overhead, ready to play their part in the largest seaborne invasion in history. They were tasked with providing air cover for the landings, But with the Allies' air superiority, D-Day would prove anticlimactic for many Thunderbolt pilots. Standing by to be directed onto targets of opportunity, they looked down and marvelled at the sheer scale of the invasion unfolding beneath them. But this would prove to be the quiet before the storm, and in the coming days and months, the pilots, planes and ground crews would be pushed to their absolute limits. As the Germans realised the Normandy invasion was indeed real and not a diversion from a larger invasion at the Pas de Calais, they began to move huge amounts of armour and troops to the beaches. For the fighter-bomber squadrons, the highest priority became the destruction of trains and panzer divisions. Shortly after D-Day, the resilience of the P-47 would be showcased during a mission undertaken by the 510th Fighter Squadron. After departing from their base in Christchurch, in southern England, they crossed the English Channel and headed to their assigned patrol area just south of Caen. They were tasked with destroying a panzer division that was in the area. As they descended down through the cloud cover, they saw a huge field that was full of German tanks undergoing maintenance and refuelling. They began their attack by glide bombing and then strafing with 50 caliber until all ammunition had run out. Each attack run meant going head to head with enemy anti-aircraft fire. Spotting the distinctive puff of smoke from the Germans' guns, they would circle around and fire all 8 M2 Browning machine guns at the AA positions. This concentration of firepower was devastating, leaving the German gun crews with little chance of survival. The attack only took about 10 minutes, after which the entire field was full of burning tanks. En route back to Christchurch, they called out battle damage. Every single one of them had been hit. In some cases, entire engine cylinders had been shot away, yet they all made it back to England. The advantage of air-cooled over liquid-cooled engines in the fighter-bomber role was clear. On the 30th of June 1944, the 405th Fighter Group moved to Pickerville Airfield in Normandy. Carved out from an apple orchard, it was one of the first to be constructed in the newly liberated area. Establishing airfields as soon as possible after the landings was crucial to increasing their operational effectiveness. Being so close to the front lines meant they could spend more time supporting troops on the ground and less time en route back and forth between the battlefield and their base. It also dramatically improved the pilot's survivability, as battle-damaged aircraft no longer had to fly all the way back across the English Channel. In contrast to bomber escort missions flown from Christchurch that were measured in hours, flight times were now measured in minutes. The downside to this was that they were now so close to the front lines that they were being shot at in the traffic pattern. Nevertheless, this proximity to the front was critical, as would be seen in the coming Battle of St. Lo and the Allied breakout shortly after, codenamed Operation Cobra. The village of St. Lo, located just under 20 miles from the Normandy beaches, is a junction of several major roads and a railway line, making it a vital objective for the Allies. Its capture would open the way to the rest of France, and as such, it was heavily defended. The German Army's elite 3rd Parachute Division, alongside the 352nd Infantry Division, put up an expert defence, making full use of the ancient, tall, thorny hedgerows, or bocage as the locals called it, that made up the countryside around the village. For American GIs, it was a hellish maze of hidden trenches and dug-in machine gun nests. As Sherman tanks punched holes through the hedges and rolled over embankments, they were vulnerable to attacks from German anti-tank units, resulting in huge losses. Progress, therefore, was slow and punishing. The German defenders were making the Americans pay a heavy price for every inch of ground gained. The advance to St. Lo saw some of the bloodiest and fiercest fighting of the entire Normandy campaign. On the 18th of July, at the cost of thousands of lives, St. Lo was taken. A few days later, General Bradley ordered thousands of American and British bombers and fighter bombers to attack the German defensive line that had now shifted south of the village. Frustrated by the slow progress up to that point, he wanted to blast a gap in the German line that Patton's Third Army could punch through. But a breakdown in communications and bad weather meant both Germans and Americans were bombed. 111 GIs were killed and 490 were wounded. The bombardment of St. Lo resulted in thousands of civilian deaths and the complete destruction of around 95% of its buildings. The village would become known as the capital of ruins. Finally, having established a strong position at St. Lo and decimating the German defensive line, Operation Cobra could begin. It was an offensive that aimed to capitalise on the now shattered German defence and begin a rapid breakout through Normandy. German forces were retreating south towards Avranches in a bid to try and regroup. On the 30th of July, the 405th Fighter Group was to patrol the St. Lo-Avranches road. Peering through the clearing morning fog, Colonel Ralph C. Jenkins was the first to spot a column of retreating German vehicles. It stretched for miles, bumper to bumper, and was only minutes away from their base. He called it in, the message was then passed on to the 19th Tactical Air Command, and the attack was on. After reaching the front of the convoy, one by one they armed their bombs, pulled a split S and dived down to attack the lead vehicles. All three squadrons of the 405th unloaded onto the column. Several times they returned to base to rearm and then headed back to systematically strafe the column again and again until it was nothing more than a burning, tangled mess. By the end of the day, the 405th were credited with the destruction of 440 vehicles. Patton's St. Lo breakthrough relied on speed and aggression. He told one fighter commander, "I will go so fast that the air forces are going to have a hell of a time keeping up with me." And he was right. Despite now being based in France, P-47s had to start flying with drop tanks to make sure they had the range to keep up. This rapid advance through Normandy produced a new mission type for the P-47, Armoured Column Cover. Initially, ground commanders, in communication with pilots overhead, were directing aerial attacks but found it difficult to judge how close to friendly troops airstrikes could be carried out. They also struggled to know whether to order strafing or bombing attacks or which targets would be most appropriate. Although the teamwork between pilots and ground troops had proven very effective since the start of the campaign, an even closer bond would have to be formed in order to capitalise on the P-47's strengths. And so it was that pilots would begin to operate from tanks alongside officers on the ground, picking targets and directing attacks. It made sense, as no one else had a better understanding of the capabilities of the Thunderbolt than the men who flew them. This turned out to be one of the greatest innovations of the war. Instead of having to move slowly, always weary of what might be around the next corner, pilots overhead warned of concealed threats such as hidden Tiger tanks and 88mm anti-tank guns. These could be bombed and strafed instead of being directly engaged by ground forces, clearing the way for the armoured columns below. The speed of the Allies' advance was unparalleled, and by August 25th, the Allies had reached Paris. The collaboration and teamwork between air and ground forces that proved so effective in Normandy in 1944 has continued to persist ever since. Although a rugged fighter, the P-47 was not invulnerable. 20mm flak was a real killer, and during the European campaign, 2 pilots on average were lost per day. Working tirelessly alongside RAF Typhoons, a fighter bomber that deserves its own video in the future, the P-47, its brave pilots and dedicated hard-working ground crews played an often underplayed role in the success of the invasion of Normandy and subsequent victory over Nazi Germany. As the Allies continued the unrelenting push across Europe to Berlin, the P-47 continued to work alongside ground troops, destroying gun positions, tanks, bunkers and anything else standing in the Allies' way. Operating from crude, hastily constructed airfields in France and then later from captured Luftwaffe airfields in Germany, they flew non-stop for almost a year, from June 1944 right until the end of the war in May 1945. German prisoners of war were often overheard talking about the Jagd bomber, or Jabos for short. Its effect on German morale was devastating. The prisoners all agreed it was the weapon they feared the most on the Western Front.